We had this wonderful dinner right here in Chicago.
Be honest, did you have any inkling?
There's a lot in the name.
What does that mean that now an American, that some thought they would never see in their lifetime, it's here?
The Vatican has ears and eyes in every corner of the world. No, this shouldn't surprise us.
Welcome to The Takeaway. I'm Alex Maragos. Today, the biggest story in the world runs through Chicago. Pope Leo XIV is a Chicago native. Still hard to believe at this point, less than 24 hours right now. But we want to get you a better understanding of who he is, what he believes, and what he might do in his time as Pope. Of course, he has a unique path to the papacy as well, something we're going to explore, and we have a very special guest to help us understand all of that today. We have Ambassador Miguel Díaz, the former ambassador to the Holy See. You're not only an ambassador, you're a theologian, and you had dinner with Cardinal Robert Prevost just a matter of months ago. Welcome, Ambassador. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks for having me here.
I just first want to get your reaction to when you heard the name in St. Peter's Square and saw him walk on the balcony. What emotions watched over you?
It was mixed. I honestly, truth be told, I had some tears in my eyes.
Yeah.
And that's partly because this past couple of weeks, I have been communicating with Dr. Emil Secuda, who is the highest ranking woman at the Vatican, the secretary for the Pontifical Commission in Latin America, and was very close, Argentinian, very close to Pope Francis.
Right.
Has personally, I can tell, suffered the loss of Pope Francis because they were friends. And it was because of Dr. Emil Secuda that I came to know Pope Francis, because of this initiative that four of us professors from Loyola University of Chicago started with university students from across the world.
Yeah.
And the first meeting with Pope Francis occurred with students from across the Americas, mostly from Jesuit institutions, in which we gathered these students to engage one another from different regions of our continent, Canada all the way to the south, in conversation over the salient challenges of our times. And so the first conversation was on the issue of migration, and the Pope loved it so much and loved the participation of the youth, and the audience was such a worldwide, and it was big, that the Pope invited the four of us from Loyola to come, Pope Francis, to come to the Vatican, and that's when so it's a result of that relationship that four of us had with Dr. Emil Secuda and Pope Francis, that then this emerged into getting to meet and then beginning a relationship with Pope Leo, because Dr. Emil Secuda is also very close to our current Pope, Pope Leo, and so last fall he came to Chicago and through the mediation of Dr. Cuda, we were able to sit down with him because he had heard about our project. And so we had this wonderful dinner right here in Chicago during the Democratic Convention, because I remember we had to find a place like literally closer to his family, out a little further in the western suburb, where we could actually sit down and be, have this great, just person-to-person conversation with him.
What amazing timing that was. What was his demeanor? Tell me about him as a person. Who is he?
And so we know that that he has this even in the name, the Leo. I think there's a lot in the name, and I think it's important to underscore the name, right? Because so he is Leo XIV, but Leo XIII, it's a pope, that is associated immediately with Catholic social teaching, and so the best kept secret we say in the church. And so you can already begin to see that there's going to be some continuity between him, and Pope Francis in terms of the social justice dimensions of the church, his words, peace, and so in terms of his personal demeanor, he was very approachable. We had honestly, the conversation was long in terms of the dinner conversation, and we raised a number of issues, and of course, as a Cuban American myself, and as someone who's multilingual, it was just great to interact with him in different languages, right? Because this is just one of the things that oftentimes, it's something that sparks my curiosity, but it's also more than just the language, because I believe that our capacity and our ability and our desire to speak other languages can be, not always, but can be tied also to that kind of openness, right? to experience other cultures and encounter other peoples.
And I want to ask you about that dinner, even though it was just a meal.
Yeah.
Be honest, did you have any inkling that this man,
Absolutely not.
no,
Well, I say personally, I didn't have any inkling.
right.
There clearly already were indications in conversations that I have had that this was one of the persons that we call a papabile, right? A potential future pope. Why is that? I mean, clearly, Pope Francis trusted him so much so that he put him as the head of the dicastery that is basically in charge of naming the leaders. You know,
Yeah.
the Pope, the leaders, and when it comes to bishops across the world, you don't put someone in that position unless you believe that that person shares your vision. And so I think that in many ways, I would say this is as much a selection of the cardinals as it is of Pope Francis continuing to get his vision for the church.
You know, and especially because Francis elevated him to cardinal, elevated him to the dicastery. I also want to just pause and think of what an incredible moment it is for the church and for the hemisphere. It was such a big deal when Pope Francis was the first person elected to be in the Western Hemisphere.
Americas,
From
right?
the Americas. And now we've got two in a row. What do you think it means, not only from the Western Hemisphere, but we've got an American and a Chicagoan at that. And given all of your history, I want to just touch on those things. What does that mean that now an American, that some thought they would never see in their lifetime, it's here?
You know, as an educator, as a professor, I always tell students that context matters, and we ought to, we ought to consider always. In Spanish we have the saying, "Dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres." Tell me who you walk with, who you accompany, and I can tell a lot about who you are, right? So I invite my students to consider the context, the historical context, the relationships that a person may have had in life, not as a determinative, but as a way of shaping that person's background. And so clearly the city of Chicago, talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. The city of Chicago is a diverse city.
It is.
Right? He went to Catholic Theological Union. This is a place primarily for his theological and ministerial training, right? This is a place rich in diversity when it comes to, women taught him. These were the women who were at the forefront of theological investigations and creativity. He's Latin American, right?
Right.
In the sense because he took on the Peruvian.
Right. Spent 20 years in Peru.
Speaks 5 languages, right? And so all of those dimensions, at least as I read this, as I read this person, bode well for his openness, in terms of other cultures. He steps into, his first few words are not in English. He, of course, the Italian, but then he turns to Spanish, right? So clearly he must be cognizant, conscious that he's coming from a powerful, he's the first Pope, not just, the second Pope from the Americas, but from the first Pope from the United States. We are a powerful nation, right? And that power can be both seen in positive terms or in not so negative terms. But he chooses not to speak in English. He traces back to his Peruvian, ministerial, the pork, and he speaks in Spanish and recalls that time and that accompaniment. So to me, immediately what popped to mind is like, okay, here is a symbol of the United States of America, not so much as America first, but America cares. And so that was, I think that's profoundly impactful because we at times we've had these clashing symbols today of who we are as a nation. Are we really a nation that welcomes immigrants like myself and others, or are we not? And I think that in the first 24 hours, his message has been one that is offering the world a different perspective.
One of the reasons I'm so glad you're here today is because you have so many hats. You have your immigrant hat. You have your theologian hat. I want you to put your ambassador hat on right now because you were talking about power a second ago. What did that post when you were there for about 3 years? What kind of view did it give you on the power of the Vatican and the challenges of the Vatican?
Well, first of all, I am so grateful to have served, under President Obama as the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, and the opportunities that gave me precisely to understand, sort of like within the belly of the whales, within the bellies of,
Right.
of various powers, whether religious, secular, etc., not just the United States, but others, the ways that we can use that power, because power is always at play, right? We can use power to impact others in positive ways, or we can use power to oppress others, to silence others, to erase others. And so for me, the time as an ambassador was an incredible platform that enabled me to bring people together as an educator, specifically, target initiatives that had to do with educating people and bringing different persons together about learning and coming up with solutions to the great challenges that affect our human family. And so one of the things that I did was to initiate this series of conversations called Building Bridges, and then Building Bridges, a series in Rome, partner with different civil society leaders, universities, etc. But they dealt with different challenges: trafficking in persons, the economic crisis at that time. They dealt with the ecological crisis that we continue to face. They dealt with issues of violence, war, and so again, all those issues that someone with, certainly an ambassador as a representative, as a symbol of the United States, has a lot of power, because that's an important role, and enabled me to see the power of the Vatican, right? Because as we always say, the ambassadors for the Holy See oftentimes repeat the fact that the Vatican has ears and eyes in every corner of the world, because of the network of hospitals, educational institutions, lay persons and believers, in Caritas Internationalis, so that the charitable work, and all those organizations are present in so many places that sometimes even governments don't have access to.
Oh.
And so we're able to get to, when the crisis hits, we're able to get informants as to how to care and attend to those dimensions.
Taking it literal, the universal church. It really is all over the place. I want to ask, so many times yesterday, especially in the last 24 hours, we have an American Pope from Chicago. Could this possibly lead to a resurgence of American Catholicism and of Catholics going back to church? But what strikes me is, I'm not sure. Do we know do you feel that that's going to happen? Do you think that's likely, of this reinvigoration that we see? And not only that he's American, but also paired with, if he is similar to Francis in his openness, in his welcoming, in his participatory nature in the church, that didn't necessarily bring Catholics back on its own in America. Why would Pope Leo XIV's papacy do the same? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, at the very least, it's going to spark curiosity, right?
That's true.
It's already doing that, right? Because this is another first in history.
Right.
And like when we started the conversation, it's the second in terms of the American continent. But it is a first from the perspective of the United States, but in some ways in continuity because of his, with his bridging with the South, with Latin America. Now, I know, as and I experienced this in the classroom, right? What we call the nuns, right? And all these young people who are really spiritual, but not religious.
Right.
And I'm speaking here particularly of those that would be Christian, right? Because I think we also need to consider that, in this dual dimension that he has as a pope that is particularly related to Roman Catholics, that's one piece of this. But the pope is also as the head of the, of the Holy See and this sovereign entity recognized internationally, which, welcomes and sends ambassadors, right? He's also a global leader, and also from that perspective, a global religious leader that can also has a lot of power
and moral authority,
right? It can also invite the religious component, regardless of what it is, to be considered not as but as part of our conversations. So, to return to your question, what will happen in the United States? Sometimes we say, well, we're a secular society becoming increasingly secularized, but there's statistics that also show that the younger people are not necessarily abandoning religion or spirituality, right? I mean, I see this in my classroom when I teach. It's just a matter of, do we engage our students with the kinds of topics that they want to be engaged, whether it's in social justice, gender, sexuality. When we engage them theologically and religiously, and I know that from experience, my gosh, they were like,
They open up.
they open up. And I mean, I just finished grading final exams in my class. I wish that I can send this stack of final exams to every bishop, to every religious leader, for them to see what is possible when a student is engaged with things that they find relevant and important in their lives. And it's amazing. And so I think that, of course, this is an added bonus now to say, oh, by the way, the Pope is from the United States and also from Latin America in that sense.
And doesn't want the church to be self-referential,
And doesn't want the
wants
church
to be wants the church to be really on the ground.
Amen.
The missionary
Amen.
part that he talked about in the speech in St. Peter's Square.
And that's
right?
a continuity with
Right.
Pope Francis, right? Because Pope Francis spoke about, this church that's a field hospital, right? That it needs to be precisely in the midst of the world, in the midst of the city. Oh my gosh, it's Chicago.
So I could tell you're optimistic about the chance that he brings people back
I
in.
hope so. I mean, and I think, of course, the office will change the person too, right? The responsibilities. I am praying that, in fact, that the office will change this person even more so. So his experiences in Chicago, his experiences at CTU, his Augustinian background as a religious, because that's another piece that is important too.
Right.
The Pope Francis was a Jesuit, now he's an Augustinian. The communal dimension there that he has as his background, all those bode well for the possibilities that he will continue to grow together with this, as we say in Catholic lingo, the signs of our times.
Okay. All right. Now the theologian hat. I need that to come on, as it just did. I think a second ago.
It just did.
Everybody is drawing lots of parallels, as they should, of the similarities between Francis and Leo. Take me through some of the differences we should be watching for in teaching, in belief, not just in background, but in how you think the papacy may be run.
Yeah, I that's an excellent question. And honestly, that's probably the most difficult question because we've only been 24 hours into
Right.
this. The hint, again, of his name, the fact that he took this, Pope Leo the 14th, in this background of Catholic social teaching, leads me to believe that. So he's been very much concerned with poverty, right? Issues of, the denunciation of gun violence, migration. Some of those things are parallel to for Francis. Pope Francis had a huge stake with the climate dimension, Laudato Si being one of his major encyclicals and teachings. If I had to guess, I would think that this dimension of the Catholicity with a little c, that kind of universality of the church, and the focus on the poor and on migrants are going to continue to be very strong in his teaching. There remains some contentious and difficult issues that the church as an institution has yet to embrace and grow in. I think that at the university level and at the theological level, we theologians have been much more open to and willing to take on and theologize out of the issues of gender, sexuality, etc. I don't see a quick movement into that, but I also at this point don't see a stop. You can't discuss that type of situation. I continue to see this kind of all are welcome type of situation. You're going to be enabled and empowered to think critically, theologically, but with a focus on the social justice dimension. And I think that's going to be the inroad, because whatever diminishes the dignity of human persons, that's the core. That's the cornerstone of Catholic social teaching, the dignity of every human person. Every person, regardless of their social, gender, racial, cultural, national, etc., physical ability, background, is a child of God and cannot be trashed, cannot be undermined. And I suspect that if that's his core teaching, then we're playing ball. We're playing baseball here. We're in the
same game as Francis.
Right? Whether it's in the regardless of the whether we're playing the Cubs or or the White Sox, right? We're playing ball here because the fundamental rule is here the dignity of human persons.
So, I mean, I know it is a tough question to answer because we're not even 24 hours into his papacy, but it sounds like, I mean, nothing that you can tell immediately will be a departure. A great departure from what we saw.
I would agree, and I think that the fact that again that he was so close to Francis.
Right, they were friends.
They were friends. I mean, I just think that Francis. I mean, it does not take much to think about that Francis would not have done all that he did, and you've already named it, if he didn't trust him. And so from the perspective of him becoming Pope, and from that Franciscan angle of vision, is like, oh wow, no, this shouldn't surprise us.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I think we could talk about this for 2 hours, honestly, putting all your different hats on. What is your one takeaway from the election of Pope Leo XIV?
My one takeaway is that our human family, which begins right in our neighborhoods here in Chicago, in our backyard, it stretches out into our state of Illinois, stretches out beyond our state of Illinois into other Midwestern states and into our nation, and beyond our nation into our border countries and continent, and beyond our continent into the world. This whole world of ours is, for Francis, in his first trip to Lampedusa, spoke about the globalization of human indifference. Our world is in need of overcoming that human indifference. And we need bridge builders. Pontifex Maximus, one of the titles of the Pope, the greatest of all bridge builders. My one takeaway is that this Pope will continue to build bridges, much needed bridges, to overcome the polarization, whether it's political or other forms of polarizations that are tearing us apart. And I think if there's one salient challenge that we have this day, is that we have to, as a Christian, I would say we have to return to the foundational teaching of Jesus, which is, thou shalt love the sacred God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. But then there's a second piece here that we forget, is that cannot happen unless we love our neighbors. The neighbors, documented, undocumented, black, white, brown, straight, gay, woman, male, female, whatever it is. But we must love our neighbor. And I think that my takeaway is that now we have someone who's very much aware of our neighbors, certainly in the American continent, and I suspect not just in the American continent, because he has experiences outside, in Europe.
Right.
And so I think that this will be someone who will continue to remind us of that fundamental teaching, which is, when all else is said and done, here's the litmus test to our humanity. Are we willing to embrace our neighbor? And even if we have differences, are we willing to embrace that person's humanity and not dehumanize and demonize that person? That's my takeaway.
Ambassador Miguel Díaz, thank you for the conversation. I really appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you for inviting.
I was so happy to bring Ambassador Díaz in for this conversation, for the diplomatic point of view, for the theologian point of view, and to help us understand on a more deep level what this papacy might look like. My takeaway today is it's so cool that this Pope is an American and a Chicagoan. And of course, you've seen all the things online already with the memes about his background and being a White Sox fan. But when it comes down to what's really important here is how he is going to lead the biggest portion of Christianity on this earth, more than 1.4 billion Catholics, and how he might try to revitalize it here in America. But this conversation helped me really learn that there are going to be, and there should be, from everything we've read, a lot of similarities from Francis to Leo. The biggest thing is, even if the theologian sitting next to me couldn't identify a ton of differences so far, and we know that Pope Leo will be his own man and his own pope, it seems that we can certainly expect a great deal of continuation of the teachings of Pope Francis and what the Catholic Church has meant to a lot of people all over the world. But given especially Pope Leo's emphasis on speaking lots of languages, getting to know the whole globe, going to 50 countries in his last role in the church, it's going to be fascinating to see how he tries to bring the world together, given his background and experience. So that's my takeaway. Let me hear yours in the comments. I'd like to see it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed that conversation, here are some other episodes of The Takeaway, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to listen on the go, check us out on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.